All right, let's get started here. So we got a great webinar for you today on the topic of killer sales content. So it's a really interesting topic that we haven't actually done a lot of webinars on in the past, and it's something that you really need to align sales and marketing to get this right. If you get it right, it's going to have a huge impact on the speed of your sales cycle, which is obviously crucial for your company effectiveness and your growth and your productivity. And so today we have Shauna and Haley from HighSpot here to give us insight into 7 steps to crush quota with killer sales content. It's actually a really hard title to say, but it's a really exciting webinar. Use the hashtag SHWebinar. We'll actually have it on the slides for you. If you have any questions or ask questions inside the GoToWebinar app, we will try to get to them along the way, and at the end, we'll have some time for some more questions. So ask some questions. I'm Max Outschler. I'm your CEO of Sales Hacker. I'll be moderating, but I'm going to kick it off to Shauna and Haley, and let's get it going.
Awesome. Thanks, Max. Hello, everyone. So my name's Shauna. I'm the Director of Marketing here at HighSpot, and I've got Haley Katzman with me, who's one of our sales enablement experts. So let's go ahead and get things started. Where's the misalignment between sales and marketing coming from, right? Well, in my experience, over time, the biggest misalignment has historically been around leads. From sales, we'd frequently hear, these leads suck. Why can't we get better leads? Why aren't we doing these marketing programs that will help drive real leads? And from marketing, we hear, sales isn't following up on my leads. The good reps are crushing it with marketing leads. So on and so forth. Well, in my experience, marketing automation went a huge way to fixing this problem. And it's because they provide this closed-loop system to measure marketing performance. So now with marketing automation, marketers can say, hey, we ran this marketing program, we got these leads, and we passed these particular leads to sales because they engaged with us to a certain degree. And we can see if sales follows up with them and if those leads convert. So now marketing is able to see how certain programs perform against other programs, how did this lead compare to that lead, and it's provided this closed-loop framework for getting the data that allows sales and marketing to have a conversation around the data rather than the leads and the subjective views about, kind of what's working and what's not. So that said, now what I'm seeing a lot of, now that a lot of companies have adopted marketing automation, now the misalignment seems to be centered around content a little further down the sales funnel, particularly around sales content. And there you hear sales saying things like, this content for marketing sucks, it's not working for me, it's not relevant or customized. And they're saying they need more. They need more customer evidence, they need more pitch books, they need more. And on the other side, there's marketing saying, hey, this content is a work of art. It's the best thing that's ever happened to this company. Because I know as a marketer that marketing really does put a lot of time and budget into the content that they're churning out for sales. And next we'll dive into some concrete stats around exactly how much time and budget marketing is putting into content. And it really becomes no wonder why marketing is questioning, what do you mean there's not enough content? We're producing tons of it. So now there's this friction between marketing and sales because there are different viewpoints and they don't have the data to determine what is actually happening with sales content. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on industry stats and whatnot because you can read through these reports yourself, and I'm happy to send these to you after the webinar if you'd like them. But I just want to take 2 slides to kind of level set on the economics of sales enablement, or rather why killer sales content matters, right? It's important for you to understand what this content is costing your organization. So Serious Decisions did this great study on the cost of content late last year. And what they did was they went out and they surveyed a bunch of different companies. And they went deep into understanding how much these companies were spending on content creation. And what they did was they divided it up by company size. So companies less than 100 million in revenue, companies between 1 million and 1 billion, and then greater than 1 billion in revenue. And what they did was they analyzed the agency costs, so the external costs that companies were spending on content, which is often a very solid budget line item. And they analyzed the internal costs by looking at who within the organization was responsible for producing content, how much time they were spending producing content per week, and what their average salary range was. And with that, they were able to come up with a tangible internal cost for content, which a lot of companies don't actually take into consideration. So out of this, as you can see, companies less than 100 million in revenue are still spending on average almost $1 million per year on content creation, 10.8 million for mid-size and 17 million or more for 1 billion in revenue and above. And at the end of the day, it's not really surprising considering how much I spend in marketing on content creation, but it's a good reminder when you see the totals of millions of dollars per year being spent on content across the industry that it's just a huge investment being made right now in content. So my last industry stat slide, I promise. The same study went on to find that if you look at the average company in the industry, the majority of the content they produce is not used by the sales team. And the stats from the Serious Decision study found that only 35% of the content that your company is putting their heart and their soul and their budget into is actually getting picked up by the sales team. 37% is not relevant to the sales team, although it's really hard to know that unless you have a system in place to receive that kind of feedback. And 28% is not even found. The sales team didn't even know it existed, and had they known it existed, maybe they would have used it. So the bottom line is optimizing your sales content and the processes that are built around that content can increase the effectiveness of your content by 300% by reducing the waste of that not relevant and not found content. So there really is incredible opportunity here to really stretch your energy and your budget around sales content simply by being smarter about the sales content that you're creating and the delivery and management mechanisms that you're using. And so with that, let's go ahead and segue into 7 very tactical steps that you can start to take today to build out more effective sales content. So I think right now is a good time to just kind of level set. Coming from the sales enablement space and dealing almost daily with sales content, everything from content management to sales pitches to content analytics, has really given both Haley and myself a lot of exposure and insight into what makes great sales content. And also not so great. So we probably know better than anyone that sales content is exceptionally unique. It's highly dependent on factors like industry or geography, perhaps even unique within your own organization depending on what product line you sell. Sales content is also dynamic and fluid and constantly evolving, both from marketing constantly iterating on messaging and branding, and from sales, both inside and field, molding the content kind of as best as they can on the fly to particular selling situations. So with that, we came up with these 7 steps, or really just kind of things to consider as you're creating or perhaps even iterating on existing sales content that can start to have an impact on the return that you see from the content, which ultimately at the end of the day will have an impact on revenue, right? We'd also like to play a little game just to keep everyone engaged along the way. So for each of the 7 steps, we'll reveal kind of like a tweetable tip, if you will. And the first 5 people that tweet or retweet each tip will be sent a $5 Starbucks gift card. So for first 5 for each tip, and there's 7 tips, so chances are good that you'll get that if you tweet fast, folks, okay? All right, with that, let's go ahead and dive in. The first one, killer sales content requires reverse engineering. So the first step to start the creation or the iteration process of content with a little reverse engineering. And what do I mean by that? If one thing is certain in life, it's that very few ideas are genuinely groundbreaking. The reality is that almost everything we do now is either a reinvention of the wheel or a plain and simple rehashing of something that's come before. And I know that I use reverse engineering a lot, particularly when it comes to my own sales content. There are a few better ways of using this trick than by borrowing the content strategy from the folks that know it best. So thought leaders, analysts, bloggers, heck, even your competitors that have probably spent tons of energy and budget perfecting the content that they're creating for the same audience that you're going after. If you compile that content, both the good and the bad, you'll start to see a footprint that offers kind of like this ultimate blueprint from which you can use to start creating your own sales content. That said, I think the whole process of reverse engineering only truly begins to impact the bottom line if you take that sales content that you're creating and you have the ability to kind of continually reverse engineer future iterations of that content to really hone into what's working in the field.
Great. Thank you so much, Shauna. The point that I want to add here is that it's really crucial that marketing and sales are aligned on content for the sales team. You need to understand how content's being changed by sales as they engage with prospects and customers. You need to understand if those changes are working. And then you also need to be able to figure out ways to bring those learnings back into the creation of content. One of my customers executed really well on reverse engineering their content. The marketing team noticed that their sales team kept changing, specifically actually lowering the numbers on the ROI slide of their pitch deck. And when the marketing team asked why this was happening, they learned that customers found the original numbers that they'd put in the ROI slide way too high and totally unrealistic for the scenario. And so they saw that the sales team took it upon themselves to lower those numbers to better fit their customers' expectations. And so a tip that we have here, and again, don't forget to tweet about this, but a tip that we have is to schedule a quarterly review between members of your sales and marketing teams. And this can be to review content and get feedback from sales as they're engaging with prospects and customers on a daily basis.
Cool, thanks, Haley. So the next step that we're going to dive into is ensuring that the sales content that you've now spent quite a bit of time reverse engineering and collaborating with your sales and marketing team on doesn't go to waste. As we covered earlier, 65% of content either isn't found or isn't used, right? But in reality, even from the 35% that is used, there's probably additional waste there as well, because there's a high likelihood that a percentage of that content is then not found or used by the prospect that you're sending it to, right? So visibility of prospect engagement with content becomes critical. And I'd say not only to avoid wasted content, but to ensure that your sales reps are able to not only anticipate what the prospect does next based solely on what they might have been told, but also those kind of nonverbal cues or actions that the prospect is currently taking with your sales content.
Yeah, this is a huge point that I see when I talk to a lot of sellers. A lot of them that I meet with say that their emails go into a black hole after sending them out, and there's really a lot of frustration here, and there are a lot of different options to solve this problem, even if you do just have a smaller budget. One thing I've seen a lot of companies do when they don't know if and how their sellers are using the tools that the company has already invested in, what I've seen them do is they conduct an internal survey with their sales team to ask them questions to better understand their daily sales process and what could make their job easier, either by eliminating or adding tools. A lot of companies really find these results extremely insightful, and one of the companies actually learned that they had way too many tools available, which caused inconsistency and confusion in the sales process, especially when onboarding their new reps. So our tip here is to do an internal audit with your sales team to understand if the tools they are currently using are helping or hindering their daily activities.
Perfect, thanks. So steps 2 and steps 3 are pretty tightly intertwined, right? It's critical to anticipate the prospect and what they're going to do next, either through verbal or nonverbal cues, so that you can provide the prospect with the right next steps, right? I mean, you've really got to kind of do the legwork up front to ensure that those steps and ultimately your sales content align to the buyer's journey. Now, as a marketer, I could probably spend the rest of this webinar talking about how to build out your buyer's journey, so I'll do my best to keep this brief, but if you'd like to dive into this after the webinar, feel free to reach out. In short, you start by identifying the what, the who, and the why of any sales project. In order for this to work in practice, you need to guide your salespeople in terms of chronology and sequencing. So using the stages of your sales process, start thinking about when they actually need to do what. Asking them to identify all the stakeholders in the first meeting is rarely, if at all, possible. So that's probably not realistic, but you naturally want to avoid a situation, right, where a salesperson has only spoken to one contact when they're about to enter the closing phase. So map it out. At what point do we need to know about the competitors that we're facing in this opportunity? When do we need to ask the uncomfortable questions around identifying the truly relevant players in the buying center? Your sales process and the recommendations for which of your sales content is appropriate for each stage should be able to dynamically adapt based on the information that you're learning along this journey.
Thanks, Shauna. Yeah, I think the big point to kind of learn here is that change is inevitable, and your content should be constantly evolving to align with new customers, new competitors, and even new technologies. All of these factors can introduce new challenges, and your sales team really needs to be agile in utilizing new content for these challenging scenarios. it's really important for the team to be able to educate and engage their buyers at every stage of the sales process. And the important piece is that this needs to be made simple and easy for reps. One of the best ways to accomplish this is to serve up and recommend the best content to use for a particular stage in the buyer's journey. One company I worked with actually decided to get their director of marketing, their product marketing manager, director of sales, and a couple members from the sales team in a room to go through and map their content for specific stages of their sales process. And you'd be surprised, it took them a minimal amount of time, and it allowed the marketing team to better understand how to serve up content in a way that's actually meaningful to the sales team. And so our tip here is content mapping is a great exercise to understand and align content to the buyer's journey. And just really remember here that content needs to be organized in a way that's meaningful for sales so that they can serve up content and engage their prospects at the appropriate time.
Perfect. So the fourth kind of step that we're going to go through is that killer sales content has momentum, right? I mean, I'm sure you've heard it time and time again, you know, that question around anyone know the difference between a successful deal and an unsuccessful one, and you'll hear it pretty much summarized in one word, it's momentum. I mean, imagine a car climbing a hill. What happens when you take your foot off the gas? The car slows down, stops, and then starts rolling backwards. So the same principle occurs in sales. When you stop engaging, prospects stop thinking about you, and they turn to your competitors who are more visible. With all the clutter in the marketplace, you really need to stay kind of front and center with applicable sales content to be remembered and to keep up the momentum. And so I'm actually going to punt this one off to Haley pretty quickly because she's on the sales side of the house and is probably pretty familiar with this scenario.
Absolutely. It's really important to stay on top of each and every one of your prospects, especially the ones who have engaged with the emails and content that you sent, to make sure that you're driving the deal forward and not missing an opportunity. I think an interesting kind of piece of knowledge here is that studies show that it's necessary to engage at least 6 times, so at least 6 times with a prospect before getting a response. And so I've seen a very high response rate with final attempt and last touch emails. You would really be surprised how many of our customers are actually able to engage with their prospects after the 5th or 6th touch by using this tactic of sending a final attempt or a last touch email. Our tip here is to keep it short and sweet. Do not bombard your prospect with a ton of content all at once and then just forget about them. You need to consistently engage them with individual relevant pieces of content and switch up your approach, whether that means the time in which you send it, the verbiage that you use, the tone, what your call to action is. All these things can give you a higher probability of getting engagement.
Cool, so we're already on step 5, and it probably sounds a little bit more complex than it is in reality, but a lot of companies fall into this trap kind of without even realizing it, where marketing gets into this rhythm where they start to produce the exact same kinds of content for every campaign. So, for example, this happened at a previous company. I was working with my team to build out verticalized campaigns, right, to go after specific industries, and we started to build what marketers call a bill of materials, or a BOM. And I noticed that each campaign, no matter the industry, had the exact same bill of materials. You know, one white paper, one data sheet, one case study, so on and so forth. And what wasn't being taken into consideration was that the personas, and even in some instances, the buyer's journey was different in some of these industries. I mean, sometimes radically different. When that gets taken into account, it becomes obvious relatively quickly that from a sales content perspective, these BOMs can't be built identically. For each opportunity, sales reps need to take into account varying degrees of buyer knowledge, differences in preferred content types. So, for example, some buyers within certain industries love case studies, need them, require them, while others could really care less. The other thing that you need to kind of consider is the various preferred communication vehicles like email or phone calls. Even social media is acceptable within, some buying scenarios. It's really, really dependent on the buyer.
For a new company, is this something that you see as trial and error? How are they supposed to know what a industry is going to react to or a segment's going to react to that's going to make them move?
I think when a lot of companies dive into new markets or new segments, it really just requires a lot of market research. I'd say, the more research that you do ahead of time on the buyer, their persona, the things that they respond to and react to, the more successful your campaign and your sales opportunities are going to be. I think what I've found most successful, particularly when diving into an industry or a market that I'm extremely unfamiliar with, is doing some outreach, both to thought leaders in that particular industry and space, as well as to analysts.
Okay, great.
More from a sales perspective, we found that the most successful companies look at content as more than just white papers, case studies, brochures, etc. The content doesn't always have to be pieces of content that are created by the marketing team. We've seen a huge amount of success when sales team engage their prospects via social media or with educational, interesting articles or even blog posts. I think the point here is that it's really important to act as a resource for prospects and customers rather than just pushing content surrounding your product or solution. And so our tip here is to think outside of your company's content box. Content doesn't always have to be product or company based. Connect with your prospects via LinkedIn, follow them on Twitter so that you can find a meaningful moment to engage with them with a personal message.
Perfect. And so this takes us to number 6. Killer sales content is consistent with company brand and messaging. So as a marketer, obviously, I'm all over this one, right? How does brand consistency affect the bottom line? A recent study by McKinsey & Company revealed that among B2B companies, this with strong and consistent branding, they're 20% more successful than those that are weaker and inconsistent. So the way that your audience perceives your brand really plays a central role in purchasing decisions. A potential customer could have a stellar experience in the sales process, but inconsistencies in other areas can be dangerous. Your sales rep could be doing everything right. They could be catering to the specific needs of the client. They could be building up the urgency and selling an ROI, but an unpleasant experience trialing the product or trying to make sense of sales content can change everything. So when a company's brand and messaging online, like their website and their marketing materials and their social media presence and their sales content are misaligned, it can lead decision makers to think that the product or the services that are being offered might not be held to the highest standards. Buyers want to see that all aspects of a company are well organized and well thought out. And these decision makers often think long term, and they see purchasing acts more as partnerships. So they want to make the decisions that will still hold true as the right choice several years from now. And so if your prospect doubts your credibility, it'll likely result in a lost deal. Your brand directly drives sales, and so it's critically important to control your brand and your messaging throughout the entire buyer's journey.
One of the biggest problems that we see is when sellers save content to their hard drive and then obviously make changes to the content as they feel necessary when they're talking with their prospects or customers. And this really leaves sales leadership and marketing in the dark. One of the directors of sales that I'm close with at a company that we work with told me that when he met with his team, all but 2 were using outdated versions of their pitch deck and other sales collateral. And so for them to solve this, they created an environment with email templates where the content is version controlled and really having a central place to store the content to ensure a consistent tone and point of view throughout the sales content. So our tip here is, without micromanaging, meet individually with members of your sales team to really understand how they find content and if that content that's being used is up to date and is aligned with the company's messaging. You might be surprised in what you find out.
And that brings us to our last tip for the webinar. I think we saved the best for last, and it might be because I'm a marketer and I love analytics and all that. But up until this point, the steps that we've provided have kind of been centralized around, try this, try that. But at the end of the day, if you can't prove that anything that you've tried has actually worked, actually resulted in a positive impact to your bottom line, none of it really matters to the business, right, Haley?
Absolutely. It does not benefit anyone to guess which content is driving revenue. So analyzing content effectiveness is really the best way to optimize your sales process and increase revenue. For companies that are really focused and their main priority is to increase sales effectiveness, this is where there's a huge opportunity for improvement. The companies that I've worked with that are able to identify their best content and best practices are really able to onboard faster and capitalize and use the content that's been proven effective. So our tip here is encourage and share best practices of your top performers in your sales team in order to boost overall performance. What content are they using? What emails are they sending? How are they engaging customers? Really take these learnings so that you can amplify them across your entire team.
And so with that, Haley's actually going to go ahead and take us through some kind of closing slides. Obviously, killer sales content is critical. And those of you that are finding it difficult to kind of manage all of these various points that we covered today, a lot of the times, what you need to do is kind of just better sales enablement. So Haley's going to take you through, a couple slides just on sales enablement evaluation, and then we'll open it up for Q&A.
Great, thanks, Shauna. So going all the way back to the beginning of this presentation and Shauna's comments around marketing automation and how that set the foundation for better leads and top of the funnel activities is kind of where I want to focus. So at the top of the funnel, marketing automation solutions have done a great job of providing ways that allow companies to measure the performance of leads through the top of the pipeline. And these solutions provide great touches and reports to understand the nurture process and effectiveness of content through the top of the pipeline. This closed loop process creates the foundation of alignment between marketing and sales by providing the data needed to have conversations around goals and the path to achieve those goals. We see that it's best to meet weekly and measure the performance and progress, and then you really have a way to change behavior to optimize results. But what we've seen is that at the bottom of the funnel, legacy solutions have really failed to break through the silos and provide the same unified, complete view from marketing sales to the customer. And so there really is this need for that same foundation at the bottom of the funnel where it's no longer just about leads, but it's about the performance when the one-on-one relationship with the customer begins to take place. So let's just real quickly dive a little bit deeper into this so that everyone understands kind of what we're talking about. In every organization, there is this knowledge transfer pipeline that goes from marketing to sales and from sales to the customer. And if you think about it, it really starts with marketing because they're the ones that are creating this content. They're the ones who are kind of understanding the buyer's journey, creating content that aligns with that. But what we've found is instead of creating kind of an end-to-end experience, it's really important to create this closed loop environment. And this is kind of where sales enablement comes in. And the idea for us here, and this is where we focus at HighSpot, is creating that closed loop by giving feedback on what content is actually being used by the sales team, what content is most effective at engaging customers, and what are the top performers doing so that we can amplify those practices across the organization. And then with this information, you're really able to, again, have that closed loop environment and have a much better knowledge transfer pipeline. So just to wrap it up, we want to give you a couple pointers, pieces of advice. If you do choose to evaluate sales enablement or other tools or solutions to kind of help execute on any of these points that we've talked about today, there are three things that we've found are really critical as components of success. The first being the sales team's ability to access content. There must be a content management system that is flexible and organized in a way that makes sense and is meaningful to sales, where they can search for content, browse for it, and even get recommendations inside of CRM tool. The second piece is being able to engage the customer with that content through different ways, such as sending out emails, doing live demonstrations, and then ensuring that the team has information on when and how to follow up. So whether that means real-time alerts on when they open emails, or knowing linger times on individual slides, having more information surrounding those activities. And then the third thing that is really important to be aware of is making sure that you're getting data-driven results. Analytics in this process are absolutely critical. Reports should include usage of content, it should include engagement of content, and it should also give you an aggregated view of performance of your sales reps and how they're using content. So we understand that this is a new technology for a lot of people, and it's definitely can be a confusing vendor landscape. And so to help buyers, we have put together a technology checklist to help buyers weigh their options when assessing solutions. And we are more than happy to send it over to you after this webinar. And I will hand it over to you from here, Max.
Cool. Got to get off mute. Cool. We got a couple questions. That was excellent. Thank you so much. So, one of the questions that we got in here was going back to, something you said earlier, the final touch email that you were talking about. How do you balance that between being obnoxious and being encouraging? And even more on that, how much of the content do you think marketing needs to have a hand on? I mean, are you doing templated emails, for reps, or is that, too far?
Those are both great questions. To answer your first one regarding kind of the final touch or last attempt email, I think there's definitely kind of a happy medium between you want to be respectful in the way that you send it, but what I've seen happen most often is that because sales has been more consistent with having frequent touches, I think what happens with a lot of the buyers is that they rely on you, that you're going to continue to reach out to them, and then when you become kind of top of their mind, then they're like, oh, they'll shoot me another email and then I'll respond to them. What I've seen happen is that when you send out that final touch, last attempt, again, in a respectful, polite way, saying, hey, I don't want to waste too much of your time, but I wanted to give you one last email to see if you're interested in our product or solution. What we've seen is that kind of creates a sense of urgency on the buyer's end to say, oh no, I actually am interested, I've just been really busy, or I forgot about it. And for some reason, we've seen that email really generates a high amount of responses. And then to your second question, I think that there's definitely a happy medium between utilizing the content that marketing is creating and getting creative and crafty in ways that you kind of generate your own content. I think what we've seen is at larger organizations, we've seen that marketing does play a role in creating some email templates for sales. For example, if you have a press release going out about a new customer, oftentimes marketing will create an email template with some of the information surrounding that new customer that sales can then go ahead and send out. But at the same time, individual sellers, need and want to get creative in the ways that they create their own email templates. And again, that's where you can begin to share best practices across the sales team and really boost overall performance.
And add that personalization to it. Yeah, I mean, you don't want it to be fully automated, so
exactly.
It's almost, take from marketing the things that they know work well across the board that have been, shared best practices, maybe the value props by vertical or industry, but then personalize the rest of that email. We got a couple other good questions here. What type of sales content tends to pick up the most traction that you see? I mean, is it ebooks, articles with tangible advice, or that feature sales experts? Is it case studies? Is there, one type, or is it, something that you have to trial and error and, based on different verticals or industries? What do you think?
I would say that, obviously, broadly, that different content is going to be more meaningful to different buyers as they're at different places in the sales process. I think that one of the things that we've seen most successful are are pieces of content that really speak to pain points or areas of challenges, or specifically to the problems that your buyer is looking to solve. So instead of just talking about your product and what the problem that you solve as a whole, get on your buyer's level and think about what pain points are they living on a daily basis, so that when you send them out content or send them out an email, they can identify with that and say, yes, this drives me crazy every day, or I get feedback from our team all the time that they are complaining about these certain things. You really want to have pieces of content that speak to specific pain points, I would say.
Okay, cool. And then as far as measuring that content, what are you measuring? What's the best way to measure that kind of usage? Is it time spent on, when you're tracking it through your, maybe through your software, you use your own dog food, obviously, or drink your own champagne, in the startup world. What are you measuring as far as usage goes? Time spent on an area of a presentation, or, what does that look like?
Sure. So we're measuring a couple different things. The first is going to be surrounding content usage. And when we talk about content usage, that means internally for us. So, as Shauna kind of talked about, oftentimes 70% of the content that marketing creates goes unused. So what this is going to tell you is what content is sales actually using. And that's going to be what they're looking at, what they're sending or pitching out, what they're downloading, those types of metrics. But then from a content effectiveness perspective, this is going to be looking more so external. So when sales does send out content, we're looking at views, we're looking at linger times of individual slides. So we can actually give metrics on individual slides. We're looking at downloads, we're looking at if they forward it off to anyone else. And then when we score content, so kind of another way of looking at it, we'll recommend content inside of your CRM tool. And when we score that content, what we're looking at is both usage and effectiveness. So what's being used most often in similar scenarios, and what content has been attributed to deals closed won or closed lost? What content has helped move the deal forward in the sales cycle? So those are kind of the different things that we're able to look at and analyze.
Great, very specific, great answer. We got time for a couple more here. So one from Tim Clark, recognizable face there. What are best practices around gating versus not gating content? You want to increase awareness, yet also want to get people's details to move them through the funnel. So, this has to do with content that you might have that you actually release to the public versus, something that's in an email that salespeople use. What are your thoughts on gating versus, not gating, and what are best practices around that?
So I want to make sure that I understand the question correctly. Are you saying ways to access content, or are you saying, can you specify the question?
Well, you would have like maybe case studies laid out on your site
right.
for people to access, and then you'd have case studies that you might use in the sales process.
Yeah.
Is there like a way that you go about figuring out what you gate, what you don't gate, what you use in private, what you use in public?
Absolutely.
What you want to get leads for, and even just like having content that's accessible, whether it's a blog post or whether you make it into an ebook. I guess there's a lot of different issues there. How do you decide what to gate, what to not gate?
So Haley, if you want. Yeah, if you want me to take this one first, Haley, because I think this is a little bit more geared, again, kind of towards that top of funnel a little bit. So it's on the marketing front a little bit, but I think that there's also some considerations with regard to those same pieces that are used on the sales side of things. So from a marketing perspective and around lead gen and demand gen, I think it's really about what your company prefers. I think every company is different, and I've worked at several different companies that do it different ways, right? I've worked at a company where everything had to be gated except for maybe the content that was literally on our web pages on our website. Whereas I worked at another company where everything was ungated. I mean, truly everything was ungated, and the only leads that we took were the leads that read the content and then actually requested a demo or a free trial after they went through that content. And I think that there's a happy medium for the most part. At least that's what I found. You definitely don't want to gate pieces, that kind of position you as a thought leader, that are educational and informational, and that you want to get out there to the broader market so that the market can start to understand, the general positioning that your company is trying to get itself into. And I also think that you don't want to, gate a lot of those pieces that are much further down the funnel, like case studies, evidence that, your product does what it says it's going to do, and things like data sheets or product sheets, so that your potential buyers can actually get the information on your product that they want and that they need. But then I think that there's that middle ground of content where you'll probably want to gate it, because what that content does and the purpose of that content is to actually kind of capture those buyers that are right on the verge of making a buying decision, that are actively seeking solutions. So those are the pieces of content that, in my experience, are best to gate. That said, that's definitely from like a marketing perspective and, what you gate out of your marketing automation system. I think if we're talking from like a sales content and sales enablement perspective, I think the sales enablement platforms have the ability to kind of send out content that isn't necessarily gated behind a form, but you can still track engagement, and Haley can talk to that much better than I can.
Yeah, absolutely. I would definitely agree with that. I think the biggest piece is to really have your content organized in a way that that is meaningful for sales. I think one of the bigger things that we've seen are a lot of tools that you might send out as pieces of content to customers. It's much better to be on a one-on-one kind of basis with the customer at that point, so you can guide them through the process. So, for example, some of the internal audits or surveys that we will help conduct, or some of the evaluation tools, we really want to make sure that we're on a really good one-on-one conversation with prospects and customers before engaging them with that type of content.
Cool. So, let's see, we got a couple more questions in here. Here's a good one. Do you have best practices for organizing content between two different organizations? So, you're putting together a case study and you're working with a customer. Do you have any experience, putting those together, obviously, and then, what are the best practices as far as like going out and developing that case study and developing it with your, sales use case in mind?
Yeah, absolutely. I think organization of content is probably one of the biggest challenges that we see most of our customers facing. Typically, most solutions use a tagging mechanism to organize content. And what we've found is that if your business is changing, which all are, if it's growing, tagging, retagging, retaxonomizing can be a complete nightmare and just a pain. And so we do have a lot of best practices on how to organize content. We looked at the notion of iTunes, where you can, most people have thousands and thousands of songs, and within a matter of seconds, you can create a playlist based on the characteristics of the music that you want to play. And so we've kind of mimicked that notion by creating a file and folder structure where you can easily drag and drop a case study, for example, into the categories that it belongs to, and then use a filtering mechanism to say, for example, I don't know what case study I'm looking for my prospect, but I know that it's an enterprise prospect in the technology industry in a specific product line, and very quickly you can narrow down from what could have been hundreds of case studies to the one that fits the criteria of the prospect that you are engaging with. And so that case study could be very meaningful in multiple scenarios, but you need to be able to filter down and use those browsing and filtering capabilities to kind of work backwards if you know the prospect or customer that you want to be talking to.
Okay, great. That's awesome. Yeah, so that was fantastic. Thank you so much. I have some more sales enablement contributors for saleshacker.com. So we're going to be doing a lot more content on not only the topic of sales enablement and solutions, but also the exact collateral and getting way more into these topics on saleshacker.com in the future. So keep following us along. This will be recorded and posted on saleshacker.com under the webinar section. Make sure to join us at our virtual conference coming up on February 23rd and 24th. And then keep asking your questions using the hashtag SHWebinar. We'll make sure Shauna and Haley get to them online. Follow HighSpot on Twitter. Follow Sales Hacker on Twitter. And thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much, Shauna and Haley. That was awesome.
Thank you, Max. Thank you, everyone.
All right. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.